Welcome to Cheese in Depth. I'm Michael Landis, and today we're going to be talking about Basil Hayden and cheeses. So we have an opportunity to be able to look at and taste some really fun cheeses. And Adam Harris is the ambassador for James B. Beam Distilling Company, and we're going to be specifically talking about Basil Hayden and Beehive Cheeses today. This is part 1 of 4 in a series, and we're going to look today at an opportunity to be able to check out and see how well bourbon and cheese pair up. So Adam is really going to do a Basil Hayden bourbon deep dive into the history, taste profile, and personality. And this really sets us up for the next 3 episodes that are going to take us down a path every Thursday for the next month. We have some great cheeses that we'll be pairing with it. And of course, we're going to have an opportunity to spend some time with Adam. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn it over to Adam and let him get going here on our adventure with bourbon. Adam.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael, very much. Hi, everybody. How you doing? I want to thank you guys for joining us today to talk a little cheese and bourbon, 2 of my favorite things. My name is Adam Harris. I'm the Senior American Whiskey Ambassador for the James B. Beam Distilling Company, where we are celebrating 225 years of making bourbon in the great state of Kentucky this year. But today we are going to focus on one of my favorite pairings, and that is going to be a little Basil Hayden and cheese. Basil Hayden, if you don't know, is part of our small batch collection from the Jim Beam Distillery in Claremont. And we've been doing small batch bourbon down there for over 25 years. Of course, small batch bourbon for us is Booker's, as it was created by our 6th generation master distiller Booker No, and then Baker's Bourbon, Knob Creek, and then what our focus will be today, which is Basil Hayden. And, I'm really excited to be coming to you for so many reasons today. One, because just this early September, we have begun celebrating National Bourbon Heritage Month. And earlier this summer, when Michael and I started talking about reasons to get together, I was like, you know what, if you're cool with it, let's just go ahead and maybe see if we can spread out the entire month of September and show people some things about Basil Hayden and what makes it fun to bring Basil Hayden along for special occasions, whether you're going to a friend's house, and let's face it, we're probably not going much further than maybe to a trusted friend or two's house, and maybe bringing a little Basil Hayden along for the ride with you. It's a perfect bourbon for gifting. It's a perfect bourbon for celebrating with, and not only a bourbon, but also rye. And so all month long, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what starts with Basil Hayden bourbon, that original member of the small batch collection, going all the way back to 1992, and then starting to introduce in the next several weeks a few of our innovations and line extensions that have come to the Basil Hayden name over the last 3 years or so. And all of these fantastic bourbons and ryes go really well with cheese. They go really well with light fare and crudité. They play really well with some cocktails that I'd be happy to talk to if anybody has any questions in the chat for Michael or myself. And then, of course, we have some wonderful cheesemakers that are going to be able to share their expertise and insights along with Michael's expertise on some of these cheeses and how well they go with the bourbons and the whiskeys that we'll be trying. So I guess really to kind of paint a bigger picture for you before we dive right into Basil Hayden is to talk about bourbon first and foremost. Here we are in Bourbon Heritage Month. What does that mean? For the better part of 2-3 decades now, we've been celebrating Bourbon Fest in Bardstown, Kentucky, which for us is considered to be the cradle of civilization for bourbon. And, usually it always comes on the 3rd Saturday in every September, but usually it's just for bourbon insiders. And traditionally that's how it had been. And then about 13 years ago or so, we decided that we would take the party outside of Bardstown and not just hold it to one day or weekend, but actually celebrate an entire month. So we decided that we would get everybody together to agree that we would promote September as National Bourbon Heritage Month. And it's a great thing to be able to celebrate our native spirit, because bourbon is truly our native spirit. And it has only been that way since about 1964. Now, might know that we've been making bourbon for a very long time. I said earlier that we've been making bourbon at the Jim Beam Distillery for 225 years this year. But if we only define what bourbon was in 1964, that's because LBJ, who was the president at the time, was a big bourbon drinker. And he saw, tequila recognized the official spirit of Mexico. He saw cognac recognized as the official spirit of France. And he thought to himself, well, darn it, here we are as Americans, we need our own spirit too. And luckily for us, he was a bourbon drinker, and he had noted that throughout our history as a country that we had had notable leaders, politicians, cultural influencers, artists, things like that, drink bourbon. You know, names like Old Crow, Old Overholt Rye, Old Grandad, things like that were favorites historically throughout our country's history. And so he decided that we would get Congress to agree, if you can believe it or not. Congress agreed that we would claim bourbon as our native spirit in 1964. And so now that we claimed it as ours, we actually had to define it and set the standards of identity. And this was the first time we actually had to do that. And so luckily we call it our ABCs. It's the gospel of bourbon. We all just sing it in a little bit of a different key, talking about distillery to distillery. And we celebrate that during National Bourbon Heritage Month. So what makes bourbon bourbon? You know, as you might notice, bourbon is a whiskey, and whiskey is loosely defined globally as a grain distillate that spends some time maturing in wood. If you're playing by those rules, you're making whiskey. But contrary to popular belief, bourbon is a very regulated whiskey style. And so we have quite a few different standards of identity that separate us from just that large umbrella definition, you know. So I think maybe we probably have some foodies here, and you would understand that I could tell you that any filet mignon could be a hamburger, but not all hamburger, despite whatever xanthan gums and meat glues you might be using in molecular culinary skills, could never take that just hamburger chuck and turn that into a filet mignon, right? So you can see what I'm saying here. Bourbon is like the filet mignon, right? So all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. So easy enough. What makes bourbon so unique is the fact that we are first and foremost American made. You can only make bourbon in the United States. 95% of it's still made in Kentucky because we have that wonderful limestone filtered water. We have access to the breadbasket of the southern Midwest where the corn grows plentifully. We have access to the American oak forests where Missouri and Arkansas, where we have our American white oak, which is what we like to use our barrels, or used to make our barrels. Also, we have a beautiful season spectrum in Kentucky where we have a true Midwestern winter, we have a beautiful southern summer, and then we have that perfect spring and fall in between. Very, very important for aging whiskey the right way. And then also talking about bourbon, we cannot add, American made. And then I talked about our corn and our barrels. And so bourbon has to be made of no less than 51% corn. As we move into rye in the following weeks, you have to be made of no less than 51% rye. And I'll remind you of that if you're going to stick along with us on this journey. So bourbon has to be made of 51% corn. We age our bourbon in brand new, unused, charred American oak barrels. We only use them one time for a reason. We take about 75, 80% of the flavoring capacity of that barrel from our first initial virgin use. And then after that, we no longer have a need for that barrel because we've taken all that vanilla and caramel and oak influence from that barrel during that one use to balance out that heavy corn grain based distillate that also has a big flavor. So big flavors are balancing with big flavors. And bourbon is balanced, but it's definitely big. And I think if you're a global whiskey drinker, you know that bourbon has some of the bigger flavors out there in the whiskey category. When we're done with those barrels, what we'll do is we'll actually sell those barrels off to distilleries around the world. Now we own some distilleries around the world as well, so we sell to ourselves, but then Scotch whiskey makers, Irish whiskey makers, Canadian, Japanese, Taiwanese, even tequila, rum, things like that are all aging in old bourbon barrels, and that's just spirits. So a lot of times you'll find some bourbon barrels aging maple syrup, hot sauce, beer, wine, things like that. So bourbon barrels are at a premium, but we use them once. And then also, if you're a whiskey drinker, you might know that the global regulation on proof off the still is 190 for whiskey globally, but in bourbon, we only go about 160. And trust me, we don't do 160, anywhere near 160 at our distillery. Our highest range is about 130 to 135 when we're making some of our larger bourbons. Basil Hayden, in fact, is one of our lowest proof distillates, or actually our lowest proof distillate. I can't tell you exactly what that is, even though I know. When we're talking about bourbon, we can't go into a barrel any higher than 125 proof for aging. That becomes more relevant when you talk about some of your bigger, bolder bourbons from us. That's going to speak to, of course, Booker's bourbon, which has no water added on the front end or back end of maturation. Whiskey like Booker's, which has maybe none to very little water added on the front end, and then some to bring it down to 107 proof, if you're familiar with those two bourbons. But Basil Hayden goes into the barrel at about 117 or so, and then it's going to come out at the proof that it comes out at, and then we cannot bottle bourbon any lower than 80 proof, and that's where we bottle our Basil Hayden, is at 80 proof. So it's a really nice introductory bourbon. It's a great gateway bourbon. Not only does it help people appreciate the category of premium and small batch bourbons, but it's also a great way to it's a great way to sort of refine your taste too. You know, you might climb a mountain and go to some of those bigger, bolder bourbons, but always coming back to that fantastic complexity and elegance that Basil Hayden has as we talk about it, is really a great way to sort of refine yourself as well. So 80 proof Basil Hayden, and that's what we're going to focus on mostly today. And then last but not least, one of the things about bourbon that makes it separate from our neighbors to the south is the fact that we can't add or subtract any flavors or colors to our distillate before it goes into a barrel for aging. And what I mean by that is bourbon is a very authentic product, meaning that the aromas and the flavors and the colors all come from water, wood, grain, and thyme. There's yeast in there for flavor and a little bit of love as well, but we need all those things to create bourbon. But as you can see, those are all very natural ingredients. We're not taking anything in or putting anything in or taking anything out of that whiskey before we mature it, other than that water that I alluded to earlier. And so if you're playing by those rules as they were set forth, the standards of identity that were set forth in 1964, congratulations, you're making bourbon. And you know, bourbon right now is very popular. Bourbon right now is more popular than it's been in a very, very long time, since Prohibition ended. That was the first heyday of bourbon, and now we're drinking it again in that same sort of volume and that same sort of thirst. And it's a great time to be doing what we're doing at our distillery. And you know, we've been leading the way for a long time. So it's fun to see people embracing our native spirit. It's fun to see people being introduced to premium bourbons, small batch bourbons through the wonderful selection that we offer in our portfolio at the James B. Bean Distilling Company. So, speaking to Basil Hayden specifically, what is Basil Hayden? You know, Basil Hayden is that bourbon, but it's a high rye bourbon. And when I talk about high rye, you know, when I mention that we have to be at least 51% corn in our mash to be a bourbon, traditionally, bourbon is then made of rye and barley. And those are going to be the flavoring grain of rye. And then we all need a little bit of malted barley in order to get the enzymatic reactions for fermentation. That's as nerdy as we're going to get today, unless anybody wants to get nerdy in the chat. But with Basil Hayden, which sets it apart from all the other small batch bourbons that we make, is that we use twice the amount of rye in this particular expression when we cook and we distill, and that's going to create a little bit more of a spicy whiskey. So if you think about rye bread, you know, cheese lovers, of course, you're going to have a little ham and cheese on rye every once in a while, right? So think back to that rye bread and think about that dry, light spice that it had. And so spice from that bread is going to be the same sort of spice that transposes over into the whiskey world. So if we're talking about bourbon being made of corn, rye, and barley, you know, you're going to have a nice balance of vanillins and caramels, some of those bigger traditional notes of bourbon that we talk about. And then you're going to get some real nice herbaceous spice. And sometimes with a traditional bourbon, that's going to come with some of the oak as well. But when we talk about a double rye shot in the mash bill for this particular bourbon, it's really going to amp up the grain spice. And so you're going to get a lot more complexity. You're going to get a lot more floral notes. You're going to get a lot more grassy notes that come from that grain. And you're going to get a really nice flavor in the whiskey itself. But before we start talking about whiskey, let's talk about Basil Hayden, the man, and the history behind this bottle here. So Basil Hayden was an actual man. You know, our company started way back before we were even a company, when it was more just like a village commodity with Jacob Beam 225 years ago. And Jacob Beam started the history of what we now do when he made Old Jake Beam whiskey. And it was nowhere near what Jim Beam is today or what the small batch bourbon is today, but it is what got us started. So we pay an homage to that. The family whiskey before Jim Beam was actually Old Tub whiskey. And for some of you bourbon fans that are out there, you might be seeing Old Tub out there on the shelf in honor of our 225th anniversary today. But Basil Hayden had a very similar trajectory as Jacob Beam did. You know, they were both in Maryland for some time, and after the Revolutionary War, as the corn writ started to incentivize folks to move into the Virginia Commonwealth, aka modern day Kentucky, you were able to get a piece of land or a land grant if you had either served in the military during the Revolution, or if you were promising to grow a certain acreage of corn, because we were noticing how plentifully corn grows in the area. And so Basil Hayden moved around the same time that Jacob Beam did from Maryland to modern day Kentucky, and they actually settled in a very close proximity to one another, Jacob farming and distilling in one side of the land, and then Basil Hayden farming and distilling on the other side of the land. And funny enough, you know, Basil Hayden was known to have made a rye style whiskey and a bourbon style whiskey and play around with the two, whereas Jacob was really just making that early style of bourbon whiskey. The families went in interesting trajectories that also parallel one another. So as I tell the story, and if I ever see you out there on the road sometime, hopefully soon in the future, you'll hear me tell the story where we'll talk about Jacob Beam's third generation really being the entrepreneurial generation of the family. His name was David M. And so the third generation after Basil Hayden was a Raymond Hayden. And Raymond Hayden liked Basil Hayden, his granddad's bourbon recipe. And so as he began to be more of an entrepreneur and start to create a brand around his old granddad's recipe, he decided that's what it would name it. So it became Old Granddad Bourbon. Now we acquired Old Granddad in the late 80s. And with that, we acquired that high rye mash bill. And it was Booker that had this vision to start premiumizing that mash bill by distilling it a little bit differently, by keeping the same homage to Basil Hayden, and then giving it this fantastic flavor that it has at 80 proof, but then also offering it this beautiful package, which is one of the reasons why it's so great for gifting. We call this the bib and the belt. A lot of people will have, one person has told, not a lot of people, but one person told me one time about this particular packaging being reminiscent of the field workers' uniform, so overalls and the belt. My only question for that has always been, you know, if you're wearing overalls, do you really need a belt? I don't know. That seems kind of like you're kind of beating a dead horse on that one, or you just really have a hard time keeping your pants up, I suppose. But here we are with our wonderful Basil Hayden, and this is our bourbon at 80